What is evil and how do we deal with it? That's what we're going to talk about today from a Hermetic perspective. Now, the Hermetica doesn't give an exact definition of evil anywhere, but it's pretty clear when you read as much of it as is available that evil from a Hermetic standpoint has a lot to do with domination. It has to do with the harmful domination of one being or person over another or group over another. And so we do have a good sense of Hermetic ethics, as we've talked about in previous videos, and it's things like we should get rid of our own ignorance. We should think critically. We should have mindful speech. We should do something about greed and injustice, deceit, envy, treachery, anger, recklessness, and malice. And those are listed, by the way, in book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum. And we also know that Hermetic practitioners believed in actually practicing what they were writing about. So for instance, many of them were vegetarians because they didn't want to harm animals. Today, they would clearly be vegans. In book 12 of the Corpus Hermeticum, there's a statement, there is one way to worship God, be not evil. It sums it up pretty well. So as far as evil's origins go, the Hermetica does address that a little bit. And so in book 14, for instance, there's a metaphor that comes up, or a simile rather, that the creation is the body of God, as is said throughout the Hermetica. And so just as the coppersmith does not make the copper green, or parents make dirt on their child's body, so God does not create evil. We do. It's something we need to own. It's not an aspect of the universe, according to this point of view. So in Gnosticism, which tends to take a darker view of the cosmos, the heavenly powers, except for the ultimate power and the messengers of light, which we'll talk about a little bit later in another video, the heavenly powers can be tricky and deceitful and try to keep us all asleep. And so they're usually referred to as archons, the authorities of darkness. And the chief archon, the demiurge, who goes by different names, Saklas, Yaldabaoth, and others, we'll call him the demiurge. He tends to be kind of a trickster figure. And what this always brings to mind for me as somebody who's interested in mythology as well as history, including the history of religion, is that the Christian devil starts out as kind of a trickster figure too. And in some ways in Islam still is one. Iblis, the adversary. And his job cosmologically is to keep things from getting too stuck and rigid and too nice. So when that happens, some power needs to come along and stir the pot. So these kinds of powers from a Hermetic standpoint, and there's some Christian Gnostics who see it differently, but for the most part, these powers are really doing their job. They're supposed to challenge us. They're threshold guardians in a way, or speed bumps on the road. And they keep us strong. We shouldn't be on the big journey if we can't stand up to them. So they have a place. They're kind of like spiritual drill sergeants to make sure that you're tough enough to go forward. So in this sense, they belong in the divine economy. They are not evil, though. They can become evil when we are in wrong relation to them and they possess us. And then they act that way. But that's on us. That's our relationship to them that sets that in motion. And there's a helpful piece from Jungian psychology about this, that when something archetypal, something big is really on your back, if you don't face up to it and find a way to work with it, then it will eat you. It will take you over. These big archetypal powers are nothing to mess with. And so the more we try to keep things normal and move away from them, the stronger they get. But again, that's on us. Evil, in spite of what Jung wrote about this, and I think he was coming from a very Christian standpoint, Christian Protestant, evil from a Hermetic perspective, is not archetypal. It's not basic to the cosmos. It comes from us. And so I'm thinking of the beginning of the Gospel of Mary as one example of many, where Peter asks Jesus about the nature of sin. And Jesus basically replies by saying, sin is not a thing. Sin is when we fail to be truly human. In other words, evil in that way of thinking about things is a problem of relationality. It's not a substance. It's not a demon, nothing like that. And the Korea Cosmo has something to add, and I'm going to read you a few pieces of that by way of illustration. It adds that we become evil when we overreach ourselves and become hubristic. When we take on the powers of the gods and think that we're actually them. Now, nobody stuck in hubris thinks, I am a god, but they sure act like it. So if you think of the self-appointed Messiah, or some of these guru figures who aren't genuine lineage holding gurus, but more like exploitive spiritual salesmen who are out to accumulate power and reputation. And they actually eventually get sold on their own divinity. That would be an example of that. It's also an example of identifying with an archetype, which then possesses you. So in the Kore Cosmo, let me read you a little bit of this to give some context. Talking about, well, I'll just read it. Then they, my son, as though they had done something grand, with overbusy daring armed themselves and acted contrary to the commands they had received, and forthwith they began to overstep their proper limits and their reservations, and would no longer stay in the same place, but were forever moving, and thought that being ever stationed in one place was death. And this is Isis talking. And then, hast thou, his generator, judged it good to leave him from care, who in the future daringly will gaze upon the fairest mysteries nature has? Would you leave him, humanity, without a grief, who in the days to come will make his thoughts reach unto the mysteries of the earth? Men will dig up the roots of plants and will find out their juices qualities. Men will observe the nature of the stones, dissect not only animals irrational, but they'll dissect themselves. They will stretch out their daring hands even to the sea, and cutting self-grown forests down, will ferry one another over to lands beyond. Men will seek out as well the inner nature of the holy spaces, which no foot may tread upon, and will chase after them into the great space, desiring to observe the nature of the motion of the heavens. Then will they not gird on the armor of an overbusy daring up to heaven? Will they not then reach out their souls free from all care under the primal elements themselves? So this is Isis painting a picture of what's going to happen if we don't limit these human beings somehow. Teach them henceforth. This is a different voice. This is Momos, who is sometimes thought of as a god of disagreement, or kind of a trickster god in some ways, speaking to Hermes Trismegistus, he's the immediate creator figure in this tale. Teach them henceforth to long to plan out something. This line always reminds me of the lack of planning in our culture. I mean, just money drives everything, and then there's horrible consequences and who's to blame, and wouldn't it be nice to plan for once? Where they have as well to fear the danger of ill success, in order that they may be tamed by the sharp tooth of pain and failure of their hopes. Let the too busy nature of their souls be balanced by desires and fears and griefs and empty hopes. Let loves in quick succession sway their souls, hopes, manifold desires, sometimes fulfilled, sometimes unfulfilled. That the sweet bait of their success It's an interesting formulation. Success in American culture is it, right? But here it's called the sweet bait of success. May draw them into struggle amid dire ills. Let fever lay its hand upon them, that losing heart, they may submit desire to discipline. And then it says, when Momo said these things, Hermes was pleased, for what he said was said out of affection for him, and so he did all that was recommended. So he built us with the capacity to learn from our mistakes, to be humble and achieve humility instead of hubris, to get over ourselves and our selfishness and our egos, and to be constructive and caring instead of destructive and imperialistic. It's a human capacity that was built into us according to this story. So another aspect of this is living with injustice and how to navigate it. And so the Gnostic Jesus and the Jesus that some of us grew up with are similar in some ways on this score, because they both talk about acquiring compassion, seeing clearly what you're up against. You know, that statement, be as cunning as serpents and as innocent as doves, right? I think of it sometimes as acquiring night vision, being able to see in the dark, acquiring a certain healthy discernment and perhaps even suspiciousness, but not paranoia. So it's almost like being on a continuum between paranoia and foolish innocence that won't protect you or anybody else. There needs to be a middle ground. And if we look to the Gnostic texts at the example of Jesus, he shows compassion, but when the archons get above themselves, he puts them back in their place. So he reminds me a lot of Confucius, actually, when he says, he's asked by one of his disciples, should we, this is centuries before the Gospels, by the way, and the life of Jesus. One of his followers says, should we repay evil with evil and good with good? And should we repay evil with good? And Confucius says that he basically says that doesn't make sense, because if you do that, won't the person just keep being evil, right? And he says, repay good with good and evil with justice. And so this is what Jesus does in the Gnostic Gospels, especially the Pistis Sophia, where the planetary archons are raising all kinds of chaos on earth, and Jesus says, wait a minute, and he sets a limit. So he cuts their power in half so that they are astrologically right only half the time. So maybe there's a lesson there that we need to be firm and just, but also fair and compassionate. That might be a good way to go. So let me finish by giving you one last quotation here. This is from book 12 of the corpus. This is a good summing up. It says, it's impossible to escape the state of death, just as it is impossible to escape the state of birth. But for the one who has nous, in other words, creative consciousness, discernment, clarity, deep consciousness, it is possible to escape evil. And later it says that nothing is impossible for nous, which rules over destiny itself and can raise us perhaps above it.